Hey, everybody, it's Ryan. Thanks for downloading today's show. And just a reminder, as always, Wake Up War Chant is brought to you by our friends at For the Table, Madison Social, Central and Township in the heart of College Town. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, from Tallahassee to Thomasville and from coast to Atlantic coast, it's time to Wake Up War Chant here on 97.9 ESPN Radio, and it's a very happy Thursday morning, January the 18th to you and yours, 1/18/18. You're currently listening to the voice of Ryan Kelly. I'm the director of digital media at warchant.com, and, well, after a pretty quiet couple days, it got real busy over the last 36 hours, didn't it? Florida State finally has themselves a full rounded-out coaching staff. The ACC has dropped their 2018 schedule. And, by the way, I need to replace my old one because it is tradition that here in the studio I put up an ACC schedule, the full one, the nice little grid special schedule. If you're a schedule nerd like me, go to the ACC.com, and they have a nice little printout where you can get every team's schedule, and it comes in a nice grid with logos, easy to follow along. It's always my cheat sheet for the year. But I still need to replace mine before we get to our conversation with Ira Schoffel that I had last night. We were able to talk about that staff. We were able to talk about that schedule. And now that we know what is a reasonable expectation for Florida State in the 2018 season, that's going to take up this entire hour. We had a nice long chat last night. So thanks for listening. Thanks for listening either on the app or over the airwaves or on our podcast. Remember, if you're listening to our podcast, make sure you're rating and subscribing. And, of course, you want to reach out to us, radio@warchant.com and @WakeUpWarChant are your Twitter handle and your email address. So I'm going to step right aside. We're going to take a break. And then when we come back, we've got a long talk, about 41 minutes worth of conversation with Ira Schoffel. So stick around. It's Wake Up War Chant on 97.9 ESPN Radio. After what was about a month and a half maybe, what felt like months and maybe even years of speculating and talking, Florida State has itself a finalized coaching staff under head coach Willie Taggart. As we continue on Wake Up War Chant, 97.9 ESPN Radio. Of course, we found out about those last two pieces over the last 24 to 36 hours, and that, of course, starts with Walt Bell leaving the Maryland Terrapins and heading to Tallahassee to be the offensive coordinator for the Florida State Seminoles. Well, we have our own Ira Schoffel standing by on the Skype line. And Ira, we'll start with Walt Bell, who was a guy that I don't want to say wasn't a number one choice for Florida State, because he is a guy who's an up-and-comer, young, energetic, great recruiter, but maybe wasn't the guy that was on a lot of people's radars as the first and foremost guy to get this job. But he ends up with it, and he seems like a pretty good fit.
Yeah, he definitely does. I mean, part of the issue with this hire was trying to figure out what exactly, Willie Taggart's looking for. Because Willie Taggart, much like Jimbo Fisher, much like a lot of offensive-minded head coaches, is going to be running the offense. It's going to be his offense. He's going to be probably the primary play caller, at least early on in his tenure as head coach. And so that's what he did at Oregon. It's what he did for much of the time at USF. And so, when you're hiring an offensive coordinator, the question I think everybody had to ask was, is it going to be an offensive coordinator name only, kind of the way James Coley was under Jimbo Fisher early on, the way, even Randy Sanders. Randy Sanders called a few plays here and there and had some input, but everybody knew it was Jimbo Fisher's offense. Or was it going to be a situation where he was going out and hiring a real offensive coordinator who was actually going to have a lot more say in the system? So, Walt Bell is kind of an interesting choice because he was the play caller at Maryland. He's got a really good reputation as a young upwardly mobile offensive coordinator, a guy that a lot of people pegged as a future head coach or, certainly a coordinator, at the highest levels. So, I think it's a good hire. But it's going to be interesting. I think one of the big things we all want to see once he gets here, once they go into spring practice is, how much input does he have? And, is it strictly, Willie Taggart's offense that Walt Bell is just going to help facilitate, or is Walt Bell really going to have his fingerprints on the offense as well?
I would imagine at the very least some principles from Walt Bell's offense will be picked up, just because that's kind of been Taggart's MO. Wherever he's gone, the staff that he's hired or the places and pieces that he's inherited have ended up becoming a part of the offense. Willie Taggart's still going to call plays. He's still going to be the guy in charge, and this is still very much going to be the Gulf Coast offense. But I think like any other hire at this point, some wrinkles being brought to the table will probably be appreciated and used with Walt Bell now joining the staff. It's still going to be Willie Taggart's show, there's no doubt about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of the wrinkles of what he ran at Maryland end up in the Gulf Coast offense.
Yeah, and I think, looks like there are some similarities. They're both guys who, like to be up-tempo, like to, put pressures on defenses in a variety of ways, but also run the football, kind of spread you out to run the football. And, it looks like there's going to be a lot of commonalities to their approaches. And, one of the, I think interesting things, again, that, kind of illustrates how different this offense is going to be from what we saw under Jimbo Fisher is, the tendency to try to do different things, to run trick plays, things like that. Those are things that certainly Walt Bell did at Maryland a lot. Willie Taggart has shown an interest in doing that as well. But, that wasn't really one of the things Jimbo Fisher was really keen on. Jimbo wanted to kind of out-execute you and out-scheme you and not necessarily feel like he had to kind of trick you. Whereas, I think that from reading articles and just watching old interviews and things like that with Walt Bell from his time at Maryland and before that at Arkansas State and other places, that's something he really takes pride on is, throwing new wrinkles, trying different things to keep the defense guessing.
Also on this staff, a lot of people thought David Kelly was going to be here as a personnel director, recruiting type guy. Turns out he's going to be the wide receiver coach, a guy who's no stranger to this state. Of course, worked under George O'Leary for a very long time at Central Florida and was very well liked in the southern part of this state. Seems like the type of guy that you'd want, a wide receiver coach, even though there was a lot of critique on Lawrence Dossie for being able to develop wide receivers. First and foremost, the wide receiver coach position is a recruiting position. This is a coach that is brought in to recruit, and if there's one thing that David Kelly proved that he could do in his time in Orlando and everywhere else he's gone, it's recruit.
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, David Kelly's been one of the, really the top recruiters in college football for a long time. I mean, it's kind of an interesting situation because he really hasn't been an on-the-field coach in several years. I think, if I'm not mistaken, going back to UCF was the last time he was actually on the field, and that staff ended up having some issues at UCF. There was an investigation, and they let go some of the staff. They felt like some of the staff members misled the administration during an investigation about, I guess, alleged improprieties. And David Kelly always maintained his innocence, was never, I don't think was ever really found guilty of anything from the NCAA or anything like that. But it was kind of a stain on his career. And then, he went and worked for Willie Taggart at USF as an off-the-field recruiting kind of director of personnel type position, did it at Oregon as well, and really did a tremendous job at that. And, is really kind of used his skills as a recruiter, which he was known for years when he was at Stanford, when he was at Georgia Tech, when he was at Duke. He was at Duke a couple times, really did an outstanding job as a recruiter everywhere he's been. Again, everybody assumed he would be taking that off the field role. And I think that would have happened if Ron Dugans had come or say Mike Loxley had come and to coach receivers. There were a couple different scenarios where David Kelly probably would have stayed in that front office role. But, the way it worked at the end, and I think, the coaching hires weren't going exactly the way it seems like that Willie Taggart wanted in a couple of instances. And at the end of the day, I think this was always kind of in the back of his mind that, well, we can always put David Kelly back on the field if he's willing to do that, and he is. And so that's what they're going to do. And then they'll have somebody else fill that role in the front office. So I think it's, David Kelly, there's no question he has the track record to do it, and certainly has the acumen as a recruiter. It's just you kind of wondered at this stage of his career if that's what he wanted to do.
I will say this though: if that's your fallback plan, Ira, that's one heck of a fallback plan.
Yeah, no, 100%. There's no doubt. I mean, he's really, really well regarded in those circles, and especially in the state of Florida. He's recruited Florida when he's been other places as well. So it's a good situation. I think, and I don't, we haven't really got a chance to talk to David Kelly since he was hired. I was familiar with him from his days going back to Stanford and Duke and elsewhere. But my assumption was, I started to wonder if maybe, at this stage of his career, maybe he'd prefer to be more of a front office guy. That's a job where you don't have to be on the road recruiting. You don't have to, coach practice and then hop on a plane and go across the country or hop in a car and drive down to Tampa or wherever. You can really focus on one task and work a little bit more manageable lifestyle. But like I said, he's apparently willing to do it, and he certainly has the bona fides to do it.
Hey, if he's willing to do it, you think you got a winner, why not? Now that there's a full assembled staff, Ira, what are your initial takeaways of this? And I know there are a couple things that immediately come to mind. It's that they're younger, they're more diverse. It's things that you thought was going to come in with Willie Taggart. But talk about that on its premise, and then after that, what are some of the things that maybe people aren't talking about with this staff that kind of strike your eye when you see the assembled pieces together?
Yeah, I mean, the youth is certainly a big deal. I mean, and I talked to, around the time when Jimbo Fisher and that former staff were leaving and Willie Taggart came in, I talked to a couple of parents of current players and a parent of a recruit, just about, this factor, the age factor and the diversity of the staff. And FSU, under Jimbo Fisher the last couple of years, there wasn't a great deal of diversity. You had Lawrence Dawsey and Odell Higgins, and Jay Graham. But there was a feeling, from some of the recruits that, the coaching staff didn't represent the team as a whole. When most of your players are African American, a lot of them are, obviously players are young. Maybe the questions about how they related to the coaching staff, and you had a lot of older white guys. I mean, for lack of a better way to describe it. So, this staff is a lot more diverse, obviously, and it's a lot younger. And I think from that standpoint, the feeling from talking to some parents is that the players should be able to respond to the staff better. For years there was kind of a feeling around the program that when players needed somebody that they trusted, they could go to and talk to, they could relate to, a lot of times they would go to Odell Higgins or they would go to Lawrence Dawsey. Now this staff is filled with a lot of younger guys that probably are going to understand where these kids are coming from a little bit better and maybe able to communicate with them a little bit better. So I think those are positives. One thing that really stands out to me in terms of, when you look at the entire staff is just, the variety of places they've come from and experiences and kind of, how much Big Ten flavor there is. And obviously there's
took the words
Pac-12
right out of my mouth.
Yeah, obviously there's some Pac-12 flavor, certainly with the Oregon guys, but the Big Ten flavor is very interesting. Harlan Barnett, defensive coordinator, he brings with him Mark Snyder is defensive ends coach. Then you also have Greg Fry, an FSU guy, but who's been at Michigan. You've got the new offensive coordinator, Walt Bell from Maryland, which is in the Big Ten. So it's interesting how many of those guys have been in the Big Ten recently. And not that that's good or bad or indifferent. It's just interesting because, you don't see a lot of we haven't seen at FSU. We haven't seen a lot of guys come in from Big Ten schools. It's mostly been other ACC schools or SEC schools as opposed to guys from maybe the Midwest.
And that's one of the things that I find absolutely interesting about this whole thing, Ira. You hit the nail right on the head. Florida State over the years, when a position came open at Florida State under Jimbo Fisher, you immediately knew what coaching tree was going to get the first look. It was going to be someone in that Nick Saban coaching tree. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. It was going to be someone from an SEC program that Jimbo Fisher was accustomed to. It was going to be something like that. But as much as we can talk about diversity on the staff in terms of ages, in terms of actual ethnicity, the diversity in the actual staff where they come from regionally, I think is a big selling point right now with this, because we've already talked about the recruiting implications and what some of these coaches can open up for you in California or maybe in the North now. And then, of course, we know Dante Pimpleton and Kelly is going to do a great job there in South Florida. We know that those guys have those reputations there. But the fact that I think you have a staff that's maybe more built to recruit nationally than regionally, and again, that's no shot on Jimbo Fisher's last staff, because in case you haven't noticed or looked at those rankings, they did a really good job at recruiting players to come to Florida State. There's no doubt about that. I'm not trying to sit here and tell you that on its head. But what I am trying to tell you is, in a world where, as we've discussed on the show, Georgia gets a stronger foothold in the state of Georgia because Kirby Smart's committing them. Mark Richt is starting to put a little bit more of a clamp down on South Florida. You've got Alabama immediately to your west. You needed to maybe open up a couple more of those spaces in California. Up north, you want to know why? Because some of those 50-50 matchups, you're going to start losing to Georgia and Miami, and it's going to be through no fault of your own. It's just going to be that those other programs are operating at a very high efficiency, and they have a lot to offer. So when you have these programs or these coaches now that have come from all these different spots, and they have a bunch of different things, it works recruiting-wise, and I think it also doubles down your Big Ten analogy. I think it doubles down on what Willie Taggart said he wants for this football team. He wants a bruising, hard-nosed, smash-mouth football team. The spread part of the Gulf Coast offense is nice and well and good, and it takes full advantage of the athletes that you get here in the Southeast. It takes full advantage of occasionally having that shot downfield and having that burner wide receiver who can make a throw or can make a catch off a nice throw from a quarterback, get open, and burn you that way. But every other down is going to be a lot of downhill between the tackles running it smack at you. Defensively, he talked about it. He wanted war daddies and badasses. He wants guys who are going to hit you and thud you. And by the way, those are all things that sound a lot like a Big Ten team. And a Big Ten style of hard-nosed, getting after it football with the athletes and the speed that you can find in the Southeast, particularly here in the state of Florida, has the potential to be a pretty lethal combination if this coaching staff works out.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be fun to watch. And, I think that speaking of that toughness, and you talked about the running attack, Greg Fry, the fact that, coaching offensive line at Michigan, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday who is in the coaching business, and they were saying, look, you don't coach offensive line at Michigan if you don't know how to coach physical brand of football. And, so I think you're going to see some of that. But also, just the different ideas and different, layers to football. I think the one thing when you looked at, the last few years, certainly the last few years, but really for most of Jimbo's tenure, you just felt like there was one way of doing things, and it was going to be Jimbo's way of doing things. And no matter who the assistants were, I mean, heck, we heard coaches say it. I mean, Jeremy Pruitt would say, this isn't my defense. This is Jimbo's defense. This is what he wants the defense to do. You would hear, offensive coaches talk about, well, this is Jimbo's offense. We do what Jimbo wants us to do. I think this is going to be a little bit different because you do have different influences and we'll see. I mean, Willie Taggart, I'm sure, has his fundamental ideas and philosophies, but I think, again, you bring in these different guys from different backgrounds, you're going to be willing to listen to Harlan Barnett's experiences and what he saw in the Big Ten from his years as a player and coach, and draw upon what, these Mark Snyder's been everywhere, Texas A&M and, all these different programs, those different experiences kind of give you, just a different context to what you're doing and give you different ideas. And as long as they all work well together, it really could make them a lot stronger than just having a lot of guys who see everything the same way.
Not saying it's going to be good, not saying it's going to be bad, but if there's one thing you certainly can say, it's going to be different. Good, bad, or different, that's one of the, I guess you could say, arguing components over Florida State's 2018 ACC schedule. The full schedule now out for the Florida State Seminoles. We're going to digest that right after this as Wake Up War Chant on 97.9 ESPN Radio.
All aboard the Taggart train. I'm really excited about FSU football and the Willie Taggart era.
Did you hear there's also a new era happening at warchant.com?
Did Warchant get a new coach?
No, but they did get a star player. Corey Clark is joining the team. Between Gene Williams, Ira Schafel, and Corey, that's nearly 50 years of experience covering the Seminoles.
Glad I finally took advantage of that 30-day free trial offer and subscribed.
And now you get the added bonus of reading Corey Clark's insight into the Noles.
Warchant.com, your ultimate Seminole sports source.
Happy Hour, Madison Social, For the Table, Central Township, all run by For the Table. By the way, Laird Hamilton Collins show, by the way, tonight at For the Table. It's on another network, so I'm not going to promote it too much, but if you're going out there for happy hour, may as well say hi to Coach as they're getting ready to take on the Virginia Tech Hokies. And speaking of the Virginia Tech Hokies, that's who the Florida State Seminoles are going to be playing on Labor Day night to kick off this season. We already knew that, though. The rest of the schedule, we didn't really know, and now that the blanks are filled in, it's as tough as you feared it might be. And this is good news and bad news, and this is the curse and the blessing of playing in a tougher ACC. When you're playing in a tougher ACC, or to steal a phrase from Leonard Hamilton, Ira, the new ACC. The new ACC that's tough night in and night out. There's nobody that you're not going to get their best shot from. There aren't those 2-3 guys that you know are going to be hauling the... This is the new ACC, Ira Schafel. And this new ACC is pretty tough, and we'll take it month by month, and we'll start with that first month, September, which is pretty easy outside of that game against the Virginia Tech Hokies, and that, once again, is a blessing and a curse. You want to try to get this offense installed, you want to make it a little bit easier and smoother of a transition for the Florida State Seminoles, but Samford at Syracuse, Northern Illinois, if you're playing Samford, NIU, and Syracuse early, well, you're not going to have Samford, NIU, and Syracuse later in the year when maybe you could use a break from some of the tougher opponents in this conference.
Yeah, I think Virginia Tech and Samford, that I think we already knew those dates, and that's about what you want. If you're going to open with a Virginia Tech on a Monday night, you certainly, if you're going to play 5 days later, you prefer to be someone like Samford, not a conference game or something like that. So that's it is what it is. I mean, that Virginia Tech game probably is not ideal for a first-year head coach. Installing new systems and all those things, breaking in possibly a new quarterback, depending on if he goes with Francois or Blackman if Francois is healthy. And so there's going to be a lot of variables at play for Florida State going into that game. At least it's at home. That certainly would help. And then you get the Samford game to kind of to regroup and move forward. And like you said, Syracuse, Northern Illinois, Syracuse, showed some potential this past season, really kind of struggled down the stretch. I'm surprised, by what happened to that team down the stretch. I think they had some injuries and some other issues, but 4-8 from Dino Babers' team was a little surprising. If they have another year like that, he really could be in trouble, even though he's such a likable guy and is well respected, but they, that's a game, you feel good about. Certainly Northern Illinois back at home, you feel really good about. But then from there, man, those last 8 games, I mean, it seems like everybody on the schedule other than Florida won, maybe 9 or 10 games the rest of the way.
October, it gets just a little rougher for the Florida State Seminoles. Well, actually, September, I did miss a date. I forget that September is actually the 5 weeks. But, yeah, the Louisville Cardinals are at the end of that month. And the thing is, I don't know how good Louisville's going to be. But as long as Bobby Petrino's there, they're always going to stand a fighting chance against anybody. They're going to replace Lamar Jackson. They're going to be rebuilding that offense, which, by the way, still around Lamar Jackson, has some serious holes and some serious pieces that need to be replaced. However, that segues straight into a road trip with Miami, and that on back-to-back weeks is brutal. Of course, you're coming off your first loss to Miami in over 7 years, in a place where they've had you dead to rights the last 2 times you visited there. That's a really rough start to the month of October, but then you get a bye week. You come back, you'll host Wake Forest right before you head into Clemson. Wake, going to be a really well-coached team. I'm just not sure how great they're going to be offensively. It's going to be a struggle for them to score points next year without John Walford and Cam Serenier. I mentioned that to Gene yesterday. So maybe Wake is, if you're not going to get a bye week before Clemson, I think Wake is one of those more ideal opponents. I would definitely say that. And yeah, and then at the end of October, that weekend, you're going to close it out with the Clemson Tigers, which appears to kind of be the place now for this game. And I think it should be the place for this game. It gives you a chance to build it up. It doesn't eliminate one of those 2 teams early in years where the conference seems like it's going to be a 2-team race, or at least the division's going to be a 2-team race. This is the right place for this game. And like I said, if you're not going to have a bye before Clemson, I think Wake's one of the better teams to have.
Yeah, I think, from a standpoint of if you go into it with the mindset of, that Clemson game is the way we've viewed it over the last few years, that's going to be the game that decides the ACC Atlantic, then you'd say, well, the ACC really kind of took care of Florida State. They have a bye, then Wake Forest at home leading into Clemson. You should at least be pretty healthy at that point. You should be, feeling good about yourself, especially if you handled your business early in the season. So from that standpoint, it does play out pretty well. The problem, of course, is, what looms right after that, those next 2 weeks. But as far as the month of October and going back to that Louisville game, when I first saw the schedule, it really, it strikes you, at Louisville, at Miami, those are 2, consider those 2 teams beat you at home this past season. And now you got to go on the road to face both of them. That's a challenge, especially the second one. You figure, if you get past Louisville, well, 7 days later, you got to go on the road again and play Miami. But I guess the question, I think all of us have is, what are we going to see from those 2 teams? Because Louisville, you're right. Bobby Petrino, everywhere he's been, they score points, but there was something about Lamar Jackson, and certainly Lamar Jackson against this FSU defense. Will the next quarterback, will they go with the same type of system? Will it be more conventional? And then also, I kind of wonder if FSU's defense is going to be more, accustomed or more in tune with stopping spread offenses with a head coach and a bunch of assistant coaches who are so well versed in that offensive attack. And I think that's one of the things that, will be interesting to see because, look, Jimbo, I think, Florida State's defenses the last 4 or 5 years really struggled against those offenses. And you can make a case that the problem was in practice, FSU could never really replicate it because it's not what they did. Well, now FSU's defense is going to be seeing tempo at practice. They're going to be seeing that pace, that kind of a approach. So maybe they'll be a little bit more in tune with it when they see it in games. And then, again, Miami, I think we're going to see next year how much of this year was smoke and mirrors and how much of it was really Miami has really turned the corner and is a real formidable opponent. So those 2 games are intriguing, but they might, as you said, they may not be as imposing as we might think when we first see it on paper.
And I think you raise a great point there about the defenses, Ira, and one that we hadn't even discussed yet, because look at the schedule and look how many teams run high-flying offenses. Virginia Tech, Syracuse, NIU, I don't know what they've run since Dave Dorn's left, but I know they're a MAC team. They're going to try to put up some points. They're going to try to sling it. Louisville, more wide open. Clemson, more wide open. Wake, at times, can be wide open. Florida, under Dan Mullen, is going to be far more wide open than they were under McElwain. This is changing to a spread division in football. And, of course, I don't even think I mentioned Clemson, who, of course, has been a big spread team that inexplicably Florida State has been very good at stopping while not being able to stop other spread teams. But you get what I'm trying to say here. Throughout this schedule, there's a lot of spread teams, and you have to wonder, with Florida State's issues against the spread, running a more pro-style scheme in the past, what would last year's defense have looked like against this many teams that run high-flying offenses.
Yeah, and you know, again, I think that it's in a lot of ways, you know, I think that this coaching change, I think, you know, we'll see. It's all to be determined. But you know, when you start thinking about things like that, you start thinking about, you know, some of the approaches that, you know, Willie Taggart's going to take that seem to be more in line with what's happening in college football. I mean, just things like, you know, fourth down math, being aggressive on fourth down, you know, some of the decisions about, you know, just different approaches that seem to be more modern, running the quarterback a little bit more than Jimbo Fisher seemed willing to do the last few years. So, again, you know, it has to be done. We have to actually see it on the field, but it feels like those are that the Willie Taggart approach is going to be a little bit more modern. Certainly Walt Bell, the offensive coordinator from Maryland, had the same approach as well. And like you said, that not only does it help you on offense, but it can help you on defense if it's preparing the defense for what they're going to see week to week.
Speaking of what the defense is going to see week to week, they're going to see a new offense for Florida and a test they usually don't get in the month of November or any time at all, with Notre Dame coming back onto the schedule. This final month is brutal. It's at NC State, at Notre Dame, Boston College at home as a tune-up before you host the Gators there on Thanksgiving weekend. So those final four games, I think our old buddy Jared Shanker, who of course used to write for ESPN, brought up a really good point on Twitter yesterday, and he was talking about the ACC as a whole, and now that I see Florida State and Clemson schedules in the Atlantic, I think it especially rings true. The difficulty of these schedules is going to depend somewhat on how good or bad NC State is, because Florida State is playing NC State right after they play Clemson, and Clemson is playing NC State right before they play FSU. If they're any bit as tough as they were last year, and again, they're going to lose a good chunk of pieces, including Bradley Chubb, who was phenomenal for them last year, they're going to lose some pieces on that defense. But if NC State's a decent 8-9 win squad, that's going to make those schedules in the Atlantic considerably tougher. If they're not, maybe a little bit weaker than what we think they are right now. Still tough, but not as strong.
Oh, I mean, you know, I agree. I mean, I agree to a large degree, but at the same time, man, Florida State, those trips to NC State, I mean, I've been going to those games now I've been, you know, covering FSU now for almost, you know, closing in on 20 years soon. And every time you go there, it doesn't seem to matter. NC State just plays FSU extremely well there. For a while, we all thought it was because of Chuck Amato that, you know, Coach Amato had gone there and he knew so much about Bobby Bowden and what FSU did and the personnel that he kind of had FSU's number. But then he left and it seemed to continue, and it still seems to continue that, you know, again, you know, one of Jimbo's worst losses as a head coach was that 16-0 lead in the fourth quarter, and they blow it and lose to Glennon and NC State. So it's really been kind of a house of horrors for Florida State. So I get your point, and I agree to a degree, but at the same time, I don't know if it matters. Florida State, when they go to NC State, when they go to Raleigh, it always seems to be a you know, just kind of the seat of your pants whether or not Florida State can get out with a win. And now you've got that game between Clemson, which is obviously a huge matchup, and then the road trip to Notre Dame. That's just a lot to ask. I think that's the one qualm I have with the schedule is putting, you know, really your two of your three, I guess, marquee opponents, Clemson and Notre Dame, you've got them 2 weeks apart, and then you sandwiched in there a road trip to NC State. I think that's going to be a lot to ask for Florida State, and I think that could be the difference between this being, you know, Willie Taggart's first season being a great season or being a season where you kind of don't feel as great because maybe it's only 9 wins, maybe it's 8 or 9 wins, because that late season stretch really kind of took a toll. And
I'm not trying to downplay the snake pit. I am, however, trying to do what I do best, and that's downplay Dave Doran's coaching ability, which is slim to none. I will say this. That game is emotional because the history makes it emotional. You raise a good point there, that the fact that it has been such a house of horrors, it weighs in kids' minds. It weighs in players' minds because they've been there at Carter Finley when they were the far superior team and they've played close games. Now, granted, Florida State's won their last 2 at Raleigh, which is something that you can't say a lot, that they have a 2-game win streak at Carter Finley. However, with all that being said, that's an emotional game because the history makes it an emotional game. And that's going to be sandwiched in between 2 games that are going to define your season, at Clemson and at Notre Dame. And so even though knowing the history of FSU and NC State at Carter Finley Stadium, it's still safe to say that that's going to be one of those emotional sandwich whatever games. And that's a real scary proposition if you're a Florida State fan.
Yeah, it could be. And so much of this is going to be, it's going to be interesting to see how Willie Taggart handles those types of things. And again, Jimbo Fisher's approach, and it just, as you start looking at these scenarios, you start thinking about, okay, this is how Jimbo handled it. How's Willie going to handle it? And, one of the things that, Jimbo really believed in was not playing to emotion too much. He didn't like to, he didn't like the players to get overly emotional going into a game because he felt like, first of all, that doesn't carry over through a game. It only really affects maybe the first few series. But then on top of that, he didn't want the players to kind of go into another game feeling like they didn't have that emotional lift, so they'd play down. So he kind of wanted them to go into every game kind of, with a professional approach, treat every game the same. And that can work, but, different coaches take different approaches. And sometimes a coach will say, okay, this is a sandwich game. My team's going to have a natural inclination to kind of back down a little bit. I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to ratchet things up. I'm going to do things to try to motivate them to overcome that. Or Willie Taggart may take the same approach Jimbo did and just say, I expect them to be professional. I expect them to be ready to come in and execute no matter what the situation is and not really address it too much. And those are things that Willie Taggart's going to have to figure out, maybe what buttons he pushed at one school may be different than the buttons he pushes here based on the players, based on the leadership, based on what he has to work with. So I think all of those things, the little subplots, are going to be interesting to see how they play out.
Elsewhere in the ACC, I will mention this before we go on and kind of think about what's a disappointment and what's a success for FSU. The ACC is quick to point out that once again they play more Power 5 opponents out of conference than any other of those respective leagues. And when you look at the schedule, it certainly stands out. Boston College is playing Purdue. Clemson's playing Texas A&M. FSU's playing Notre Dame. Louisville's playing Alabama. NC State's playing West Virginia. Duke is playing Northwestern. Georgia Tech is going to play South Florida, and they're going to play Georgia. South Florida, not exactly a Power 5, but you get the idea. It's a tough opponent. Miami's going to be playing LSU. North Carolina is going out to Cal. Penn State and Pitt, of course, have renewed that series. Virginia is going to play a decent Indiana squad, and Virginia Tech, even though 3 of their out-of-conferences aren't that great, they end up drawing Notre Dame. That is one thing that you will say about this league, is that they are not scared to play anybody.
Yeah, and that really has been a push, from the administration, at the ACC. I mean, John Swofford, they didn't take the stretch or take the action that some conferences talked about, where some of these conferences have talked about banning playing FBS school or FCS schools, or really focusing on Power 5 opponents because how important that strength of schedule is for the college football playoff. So they didn't take those measures, but they were strongly encouraged to really schedule tough opponents out of conference because of what it means. I mean, we've seen it over the last few years. Really, the way the ACC has gained more respect beyond FSU and Clemson winning national titles was the fact that they did start winning a lot of these non-conference games, and how important that is. But I think that that's one of the things. Another one of the things I want to see with Willie Taggart is what kind of input is he going to have in scheduling for Florida State? Clearly the administration likes these big marquee non-conference games, like last year playing Alabama, the year before that against Ole Miss, previously, Oklahoma State, getting these big checks for these big neutral site games and the exposure they bring. Jimbo was okay with them as long as they really brought in a big check, and it was a team that it wouldn't kill you if you lost. Like, he didn't mind the Alabama game in theory because even if you lost it, you could get back in the national title picture. Of course, it didn't work out that way for FSU this year, but that was the theory. I'm curious to see what Willie Taggart next, one of the next times we get to talk to him, I really want to pick his brain about this. How does he feel about it? And how much of a role is he going to take in scheduling? Some coaches don't. They kind of leave it to the administration. Bobby Bowden really kind of left it to the administration. He didn't feel like it was his place to mandate who they played, when, and where. Jimbo tried to be a little bit more active with it. And again, I'm kind of curious to see what Willie Taggart's approach is going to be.
I'm interested, and I hope it includes more home-and-homes. Real quick, Ira, because we've maybe only got a minute here. Your ideal record, what record does Florida State have to consider this a successful season?
Look, I think people aren't going to be like over the moon if they're 9-3, but to me, I feel like first year with this schedule, opening up with Virginia Tech, that really tough stretch late in the season, the back-to-back Louisville, Miami. I just think they're, if you're 9-3, I think, it's solid. That's a solid season. You can't be too upset about it, especially with all that you lost on defense and so many early departures. I think that's a, solid season. If they won 10 games, I think people would have every reason to be super excited. If they only win 8, it's not the end of the world. Again, it's your first year implementing a new system. I don't think there's anything to panic about, but I think 9 is a really good barometer that, okay, this is on the right track. This isn't going to be a major long-term process to get things back on track, especially with this tough of a schedule.
I think it's 9-3, and I think 2 of those wins have to be over rivals. I think you have to go 2-1 against Florida, Miami, and Clemson, because at the end of the day, if you can't beat your rivals, you're never going to keep your fans happy.
Yeah, certainly. I think Miami and Florida seem to be the more likely of the two. But it's if they only win one of those, I think people will be a little bit frustrated. But at the same time, I do hope that fans understand that, Willie Taggart, I think there's a perception from some people that Willie Taggart's coming into a ready-made program where he can flip the switch and this thing's going to be humming again. But I think the reality is this team was 7-6 for a reason. They have things they have to work on.
The talent's there, but obviously some culture things, some issues need to be fixed. You're absolutely right. But if you can fix those things, the talent's there. Like I said, you can make this a turnkey program. That doesn't mean it's going to be a turnkey program.
Yeah, I think things like, discipline. Some of the things that, we saw play out on the field, situations where, really the best example you could point to, I think one of the best examples would, be the Matthew Thomas play against Florida, where he kind of dives into the end zone instead of just running into the end zone. And that play ends up being, in a competitive game, that could have lost you a football game. And those are the kind of things you saw a lot of from this team. Team really seemed to lack discipline the last year or two. You saw players, kind of laughing on the sideline during different situations where you wouldn't like that. You DeAndre Francois not show up to senior day. So, I think that when you talk about those culture things, I don't know if it was as bad culture-wise as some people have said, but there's a lot of things to be concerned about. And sometimes those things can be fixed quickly because, the personality of the head coach and the buy-in. But sometimes, it takes a little longer, and sometimes you have to run some players off. Every situation is different, but it's not, there's no guarantee of how quickly that's going to turn around.
Absolutely. Ira, we're all out of time, but this has been a fun chat. It's been a fun day, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Take care.
My thanks to Ira. My thanks to you for listening. We'll be right back here tomorrow for a Friday edition of the show. Golic and Wingos up next on 97.9 ESPN
Radio. WarChant.com is the ultimate inside source for FSU football and recruiting. And now you can get in on the action for free for an entire month. WarChant.com is offering a risk-free 30-day trial subscription. Get full access to the #1 website covering the Seminoles just by entering the promo code WarChant30. That's WarChant30. Sign up and get in on the world's most active FSU message boards. Receive breaking news, stories from our award-winning staff, plus get exclusive interviews and videos. Just enter the promo code WarChant30. WarChant.com, your ultimate Seminole sports source.